Thanks for coming this morning, and welcome to a lecture on sentience. I'm giving you this lecture, and it's probably occurred to you there are not that many formal lectures in the veterinary programme, so why is it that we're giving you a formal lecture on sentience? There are a couple of answers to that. The first answer is that sentience is really important for New Zealand because sentience is enshrined in the Animal Welfare Act in New Zealand, and New Zealand was the first country in the world to enshrine sentience as a feature of animal welfare in an Animal Welfare Act. Many of us are very proud of that, but as a veterinarian trained in New Zealand, especially when you go overseas, people will expect you to have a view on that and to have some understanding of what it is and what it means. The reason for doing this in a traditional lecture is because the subject is developing really rapidly. Every time I give this lecture, I have to revise it and think about, is what I'm saying correct? And every time I give it, I find myself changing it a little bit. In talking about sentience and in couching it in a sort of veterinary context and a New Zealand context, I'm drawing information from many sources, and we wouldn't really expect you to do that for yourselves. It's much easier, I think, if I can draw that information together and present it to you with a bit of a this is what it means spin on it. And as yet, there is no good overview of sentience in New Zealand in the public domain. And even if there were one published today, it would probably not be so good in 6 months' time. Things are moving really rapidly in this area. Sentience is kind of a development of the relationship that we have with animals. Humans have had a relationship with animals for as long as we've been humans, but we find that that relationship is changing, and as it changes, our view of what an animal is and how we should interact with an animal changes. And the current understanding of that is bound up in this thing, this sentience of animals. So that's what I want to unpack today. This is where we're going. We're going to start off by trying to define what sentience is. That's easier said than done, but we'll give it a crack. Talk about why sentience occurs and what its advantages are. I then want to make some important statements which are a little bit standalone, but hopefully when we get there, you'll see why they fit in. And then I want to talk about sentience in a legislative way and talk about how the law deals with sentience. And in order to do that, we have to do a little bit about intrinsic and extrinsic value. We'll do a little bit of history of ethics. Yay, isn't it fun? And then we'll talk about sentience and agency, talk about the legislative developments that have been going on, particularly in New Zealand, and finish up with an attempt to explain how animal welfare views and animal rights views spin out of this idea of sentience. I'm hoping that by the end of today's session, you will be able to define sentience, describe its advantages and its costs, link sentience to intrinsic value. We'll talk about intrinsic value more in the second half of the lecture. Compare sentience and moral agency, and discuss the legal relationship between welfare and rights. When I say relationship, it's kind of a tension, but that is a relationship, isn't it? Okay, let's get started and let's talk about what sentience is. I often start with Wikipedia when I want to find definitions for things, just because it's there and it's free and it's easy. Wikipedia says that sentience is the capacity to feel, perceive or experience subjectively. And that's okay, but it's not the most useful definition, I don't think, for our purposes. John Webster was Professor of Animal Husbandry at the University of Bristol for many years, and John's definition of sentience, I think, is my favourite. John said, a sentient animal is one for whom feelings matter. An animal that has feelings, and those feelings matter to it. They are important to it. The only problem with John's definition is that it's a little bit outdated now. And that concept of feelings is something that we've kind of not moved on from, but learnt to define in a more modern way. And in order to do that, we need to talk about affective states. An affective state is what it feels like to feel an emotion. It's not the emotion itself, it's what it feels like to feel that emotion. And I've put up some examples of affective states here. And so you can see that these people are expressing different emotions, but the affective state is not the emotion of boredom, but what it feels like to be bored. What does it feel like to be subjected to one of my lectures for an hour? And so when we understand that kind of boredomness of boredom that is the affective state, we can go back to sentience, and we can say that a sentient animal is one that is subject to affective states. And I want to point out that this is a more modern way of saying exactly the same thing that John Webster said in the 1990s. It's just modern terminology, and that affective state terminology is how you will meet welfare and sentience as you go through the programme. So that's what sentience is. Why does it occur? Well, the short answer is we don't know why it occurs, but there are various theories as to why it might occur. Some animals have more complex central nervous systems than others, and we think that complex nervous systems confer a set of advantages and disadvantages to their owners. So, for example, if I put you in a locked room with an organism that was exactly like you, but it didn't have a complex nervous system, you would starve to death first, because your complex nervous system takes up a lot of your energy needs. Unless you used your complex nervous system to work out how to escape from the room and you went down to the local dairy and got some food. That's the advantage of your complex nervous system. It costs you energy, but you can utilise it to gain benefits. The current orthodox view suggests that sentience is an emergent property of a complex nervous system. If you have a complex nervous system, then sentience just appears. You become aware of yourself in some kind of almost magical way, and you develop this way of being by which your emotions, your affective states matter to you. Just for completeness, while you're sitting doing very little, listening to me, your central nervous system is accounting for about 60% of your energy consumption. That's what you're paying for it. Hopefully the benefit you're getting is that you're able to listen to me and understand what I'm saying. So it's swings and roundabouts. So I've talked vaguely about the advantage of sentience. What is the advantage? Well, first of all, let's look at our sentient advantage as humans. We have two particular advantages that come from having a complex nervous system. The first one is language. Because we have a complex nervous system and because we're social mammals, we can communicate with each other in a very precise way using language. I can use language to convey to you some really quite delicate concepts, and you can listen to those and form your own opinions about them. And as humans, we can write that language down, and so we can lock in our understanding, not just within our social group, but across generations and across the world. That's a huge advantage, and it comes from that complex nervous system. This is our other sentient advantage. As the end of a limb goes, this doesn't look very impressive, really, if you compare it to, a velociraptor with a great big hook, or something with a sucker on the end. It's not, it's got no claws, it's not really very flash. But because we're smart, we can turn it into all sorts of things. Yeah, if I go home and play in my garage, this can be a spanner, or a pair of pliers, or a craft knife, or a pen, or many other things. And so we can use these things to manipulate our environment, to manipulate the world around us, and gain advantages. I have no idea really how a car works, but I can come to work in a car in the morning because somebody who has a spanner knows how a car works and can build one. So we have that community social advantage. Other smart animals have sentient advantages, and generally we see them in three spheres. We see them in social animals, animals that have gained an advantage by having a society where they know their place in society. We see it in animals that can maneuver through complex three-dimensional environments very rapidly. Birds, gibbons, that kind of thing. And we see it in animals that are hunters, particularly lone hunters in complex three-dimensional spaces, and the octopus is the type there. Learning their environment, learning where their prey is likely to be, learning how to sneak up on and catch their prey. There's one more thing I want to say about our sentient advantage that links back to affective states. Because I have hands, I can play a tin whistle. And playing the tin whistle brings me pleasure. It generates in me an affective state that I enjoy perceiving. It feels good to me. And so our sentient advantage is all bound up in that affective state thing that brings about a need for welfare, or a need to consider the affective state of other beings. That link between pleasure and other beings leads me to make some important statements which are kind of linked and kind of not, but I can't do the second part of this lecture without you understanding these statements. So, we use smell to hunt for food, whether that's snuffling around in the undergrowth looking for truffles, or whether that's on the high street sniffing out a good restaurant on a Saturday night. If we're a carnivore, we might sniff out a good steakhouse. The point I want to make here is that when we use smell to hunt for food, oh man, it feels good. Yeah, you go past that good Indian restaurant and you go, yeah, that's where I'm eating tonight. I'm sorted. Fish use lateral lines to hunt for food. What does that feel like? I don't know. I haven't got a lateral line. Anybody got a lateral line? We don't know what it feels like. But we do know that when we engage in sensory hunting for food, it feels really good. I guess the point I'm making is that to say that a fish has affective states is not to say that it has the same affective states that we have. It's going to use different sensory mechanisms to feed into a different set of affective states. We acknowledge that a fish has affective states, but I need, about a bottle and a half of red wine before I can believe that I can understand what an affective state in a fish might feel like. It's not an easy thing to do. I guess what I'm trying to say is that we should not apply our own biological norms to fish, or any other animal that we deal with. We need to think about these animals as their own entities, their own selves. We acknowledge that they have affective states, and for some animals the affective states might be quite similar to us in some respects, but they're not the same as our own affective states. Okay, let's get in to talk about intrinsic and extrinsic value, because I want to lead that through agency into a kind of understanding of the legislative developments. We've been talking together over the last few weeks a little bit about ethics and values and beliefs. And I hope you've come to realise that in Western ethics, which is what I'm going to be talking about, because this idea of welfare, rights, sentience comes from a Western ethical standpoint, we kind of have three main ways that we judge the rightness or the goodness of an action. We can say an action is good because its intended purpose is good. And we call that a value-based ethic, maybe. It comes from teleology, which is a Greek position. Aristotle, Plato, Socrates developed this idea of teleology, and they said that the important thing was to try and do the right thing, to have an action whose intended outcome was good. There's a rule-based ethics called deontology, but you can call it various other things as well, that says that an action is right if it obeys the rules. Here's a set of rules. If we do the right thing by the rules, we've done the right thing. And the third option is an outcome-based ethic. We usually call it utilitarianism. An action is right if it leads to good outcomes. And those really are the options we've got. And hopefully you can see the holes in all of those. Yeah? An action is right if its intended purpose is good. Well, I'm meant to do good. Look how badly it's screwed up. Was that the right thing to do? An action is right if it obeys the rules. I mean, the rules don't always seem to describe what we think is the right thing to do. And sometimes we have a lot of angst about, should I obey this rule if I think it's a bad rule? And utilitarianism, an action is good if its outcomes are good. How can we know? How can you know that what you will do today has a good outcome in 10 years' time? You can't. So if you're a utilitarian, you can't actually do anything really because you can't predict your outcomes very precisely. The point about all of those systems is that when we're talking about doing good, we are talking about considering a subset of entities that we call sentient. So, for example, it means something to behave in a good way towards a sheep. It probably doesn't mean very much to behave in a good way towards a deck chair. Yeah? A sheep has sentience, and therefore it has some kind of need to be considered as the possible recipient of a good deed. A deck chair doesn't have sentience, and nobody would think that you could do a good deed towards a deck chair. Sentience confers intrinsic value. I'm saying the same thing in a different way there. A sheep has intrinsic value, and therefore it can be the recipient of something that is morally good. A deck chair does not have intrinsic value, and therefore it cannot be the recipient of something that is morally good. What's interesting about the Western ethic is that Plato, Aristotle, Socrates developed these theories and ideas about what good was, maybe 3,000 years ago now. And those ideas caught on with a small cult that developed in Judea about 2,000 years ago. But that cult had the good fortune to become the dominant religion in the Western world through the Roman Empire. And when in the medieval period the Western world defined laws and codified ways to behave, it was that ethical principle that underpinned all those laws. Many of us don't hold to these ethical principles anymore. There are many people in New Zealand who don't think that there is a Christian God who lives in heaven. There are many people that do, but as a society, we don't use it in the same way that we did maybe 400 or 500 years ago to define who we are and how we behave. Nonetheless, in many modern documents, you will see language that comes from those ethical histories. If you look in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights or in the New Zealand Bill of Rights, you will see very similar language about the rights that people have. The right to life, the right to education, the right to not be persecuted, for a whole list of things. And all those rights are expressed in language that comes directly from that Christian ethic that comes from Socrates and Plato. It's all historically there, and so that's how our Western society confers rights and values on things. Okay, we've talked about intrinsic value, a value to itself. We also need to talk about extrinsic value, which is a value to people. And now you can see that both a sheep and a deck chair have extrinsic value. Yes? A sheep has extrinsic value. A lamb shank is quite a nice thing to come across on a Friday evening. And a deck chair also has extrinsic value. It can be quite comfy to sit on a deck chair. But that value is a value to something else outside of yourself. Does a fish have intrinsic value? Well, luckily in New Zealand, the Animal Welfare Act says that a fish is an animal, animals are sentient, and we know that sentience confers intrinsic value. So it's easy. A fish has intrinsic value. The problems we have at the moment, and the places where we are wrestling with this concept of sentience, is what about things that the Animal Welfare Act doesn't declare as sentient that might have an intrinsic value, that might be sentient, that might have affective states that matter to them. These are three of the biggies at the moment. Everybody's talking about robots and computers and AI, and, you know, will Terminator turn out to be real? Is it going to be looking like the Matrix in a century's time? Who would know? But we don't yet have an orthodox view about whether or not sentience is a thing that develops from complexity of information processing, computers are in, or if you also need to be a carbon-based life form, computers are out. Who would know what the answer to that is? The eusocial insects are really interesting because a single eusocial insect is almost not a life form. If you look at the things that you need to be able to do in order to be considered to be alive, a bee can't do those things. Not all of them. But a colony of bees, a hive, oh man, they can do all of those things and more. And so the eusocial insects are challenging because it might be that as a single organism, they're not great, but as a colony, as a society of organisms, they can get over that hurdle and be considered sentient. Who would know? And finally, spiders. Spiders are doing really well in the sentient states at the moment. As we look at spiders, it turns out that they can do many of the things that we thought only mammals could do, or at least vertebrates. Their information processing is really quite subtle, but they do it with something that's mostly outside their body. They make a web, and the web gives them lots of information about their environment and their world, and they use that to process information and to work out what's going on. There was a review published by Bob Elwood, who is one of my heroes in this realm. He's been working in sentience mostly with hermit crabs, but for many years, and has done some really awesome, groundbreaking work. But he's beginning to look at arthropods and has some good evidence in this review that strongly suggests that we might have to think that arthropods are sentient. Interesting stuff. Okay, let's talk about sentience and agency. I've said now several times that sentience confers intrinsic value. But moral agency confers rights. When you look at the rights of people in the New Zealand Bill of Rights Act or the UN Declaration of Human Rights or any of those things, the rights are conferred on the people because they have moral agency. They have the capacity to behave in a moral way. And actually, those rights come with potential consequences, or at least responsibilities. Yeah? You have the right to freedom, but you have the responsibility not to kill somebody. And if you do kill somebody, your freedom is going to be taken away from you. So those rights come with an understanding that this is the way that we should act. How do we legislate for something that is sentient but does not have moral agency? That is one of the biggest problems in animal law. How do we deal with that? Luckily, we have a model. We have a model of something that will become a moral agent, but is not a moral agent just yet. And that's a child. So if you look at the way that the legislation behaves towards children, you can think about ways in which the legislation might be behaving towards animals. Because young children and animals both have sentience, but not yet moral agency. Let's look at how that plays out in the legislative domain. Traditionally, animals are property. Animals can be traded as goods. We can buy them, we can sell them. Animals can belong to people in the same way as other objects can belong to people. So in the law, if you own a computer or a cup of coffee or a car, you can own an animal in the same way. I can say I have children, and I do, but I don't own those children in the same way that I own my car, because those children are moral agents. Well, they are now. They're plenty old enough to be moral agents, although I sometimes question with the ways they behave. That's a lecture for another day, to another set of people. But the point is that we're increasingly saying when we own an animal that we don't own it in the same way as we own a thing. If you own a deck chair, you can sell it, you can sit on it, you can paint it blue, you can chop it up for firewood, you can do whatever you like to it. And people will not complain about the rights of the deck chair. You might say you're an idiot for painting the deck chair blue, who would do that? But they're not going to complain about the deck chair. The deck chair doesn't have that moral consideration. If you own an animal and you don't keep it in the manner which the codes of welfare say that you should keep it, people will complain at you and you will be prosecuted for an infringement of the Animal Welfare Act. And so owning an animal is not the same as owning a deck chair, and owning a child is not the same as owning a deck chair. The two things are different because we believe that animals have intrinsic value because of their sentience. So increasingly, we're treating animals as sentient beings. And if you look in the legislation for that, the first thing that the Animal Welfare Act says in its purposes, purpose 1, to recognise that animals are sentient. To recognise that we need to treat them as things with not just extrinsic value. The codes of welfare stipulate levels of care that we must provide for animals, even though we own them, because they are recognised as sentient. And we've even gone further than that, and if you look at our legislation, some animals now have rights. The great apes, for example, have rights that go beyond welfare. They have a right to be treated in a certain way, which speaks to their dignity rather than their need to have their affected states addressed. So finally then, we need to talk about welfare and rights. And in order to do that, we need to talk about the differences between extrinsic value and intrinsic value. So do animals have extrinsic value? Do they have a value to humans? Well, here's a piglet. Over the lifespan of this piglet is expected to generate about $25 of profit for its farmer. That is that animal's extrinsic value. And here's a dairy cow. And over the life of the dairy cow, that dairy cow is expected to generate about $2,000 of profit for its farmer. That is the extrinsic value of a dairy cow. Do animals have extrinsic value? As George Orwell said, yes, all animals are equal, but some animals are more equal than others. And the information on that slide is exactly why, over the course of your career, you will on average see more dairy cows than piglets. because of the difference in extrinsic value. So, yes, animals have extrinsic value, but the extrinsic value of some animals is more than others. Some animals are more useful to us as people than others. Do animals have intrinsic value? That's much more of a philosophical question. And so you can answer that in two ways. You can say yes, or you can say no. And I can't argue with either of those two ways of answering that question. Except that if you say yes, animals have intrinsic value, then you are tending towards a view that will express itself through rights. And if you tend to say no, you will be tending towards a view that expresses itself in terms of welfare. Remember when we were talking about values and beliefs, and I showed you my answer to the questionnaire a couple of weeks ago? I was mostly utilitarian and a little bit rightsy. This is why. It's because I'm coming to understand that animals have more intrinsic value than I thought they did 20 years ago. And that's leading me to express my views about how we should treat animals in a more rights-based way than a welfare-based way. I'm still mostly welfare, I'm still about 75% welfare, but some rights views are kind of tempering that, creeping into that. The other interesting thing to say is that if you express a rights-based view, you tend to think about things in terms of teleology and deontology, values and rules, input-based ethical theories. And if you think about the world in terms of welfare, you tend to think about things in a more utilitarian way, more outcome-based, more what is the best way to get a good outcome from this situation. So there is a tension in New Zealand society at the moment between providing welfare for animals and recognising that at least some animals have rights. And that tension is bound up in this balance between the extrinsic value of the animals, which leads to a welfare way of thinking, and the intrinsic value of the animals, which leads to a more rights-based way of thinking. Okay, I think that's enough complicated stuff for one morning. Let's have a summary. This is the too long didn't read take-home message. A sentient animal is one that is subject to affective states. Hopefully I've banged on about that enough. Everybody understands what's going on there. Neurological complexity is expensive in a metabolic sense, but it can be quite useful. Sentience confers intrinsic value and demands consideration of welfare, but it's moral agency that confers rights. And the relationship between rights and welfare is complicated and it's still developing, and who knows where it will be in 10 years' time from now. Certainly 10 years ago I could never have predicted that we would be where we are today, and we're moving quite rapidly. Ngā mihi, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa.